There's a detail in cold weather death investigations that unsettles people the first time they hear it. In the final stage of hypothermia, victims very often take their clothes off. Coats found folded in the snow, boots set neatly beside a body. Investigators have documented it for centuries, and they gave it a name: paradoxical undressing. The cold doesn't kill you by freezing you. It kills you by convincing you that you're warm. That tells you something the survival shows never do. Long before your fingers stop working, your judgment has already stopped working. Risk assessment is the first system to fail. You don't feel yourself getting stupid. You feel calm and reasonable and certain that the decision you're making is a good one. Which leads to a conclusion that sounds strange until you sit with it. In the far north, every life or death decision has to be made while you're still clear-headed. And that means it has to be made months in advance. Because the conditions themselves leave no room for improvisation. Wind there doesn't blow, it cuts, pulling heat out of a body faster than the body can replace it. Snow throws the light back until distance stops meaning anything. Air that dry and that cold takes water out of your lungs with every breath. And inside that, the Cree, the Lakota, the Blackfoot, the Ojibwe lived. Not for one hard season, but for generations. No metal that would shatter in the cold, no machinery, no industry. Just wood. Winter has 6 ways of killing a person. They had 6 answers, and not one of them was invented on the spot. But their system had something strange in it. It was deliberately less efficient than it could have been. They knew how to take more. They chose not to. And the reason isn't what you're thinking. To understand how, you have to stop thinking of the forest as a warehouse. It wasn't a place you went when you needed something. It was a calendar. Every species opened for a few weeks a year on its own schedule, and then it closed. And no amount of need or effort could talk it into opening again. Birch is the clearest example. Its bark only separates cleanly while the sap is moving and the tree is waking up. Arrive too early and the bark won't release. Force it, and you strip the tree down to the wood and kill it. Arrive too late, and it tears into ragged, useless pieces. That window is narrow, it isn't marked, and it shifts by weeks depending on the year. And here's what makes that window so much more serious than it sounds. Fine motor control is one of the first things the cold takes. Earlier than pain, earlier than any sense that you're in danger. Stiff fingers can't peel a thin sheet of bark off a trunk without ruining it. Which means the material that keeps you alive in January cannot be gathered in January. It has to be gathered in June by hands that still work. Steady hands are a resource with an expiration date, and they spend that date long before winter arrives. That's the first thing winter kills you with. The simple inability to make fire. Birch bark answers it because it carries betulin, which makes it shed water, and volatile oils that will take a spark when everything around it is soaked or frozen. And out there, a failed ignition isn't a delay. It's body heat you never get back. The rest of the forest read the same way. Birch peels in sheets. Pine bleeds resin. Willow bends instead of breaking. Cedar refuses to rot. Those weren't lovely observations. They were specifications. But that calendar was never printed anywhere. It lived in somebody's head. And that leads to a strange truth about a winter lodge. The most valuable person inside it was usually the one who could no longer walk out of it. We'll come back to that person. First, the next thing on winter's list. And it isn't a bear, and it isn't a blizzard. It's a cut across the back of a hand. not the bleeding. 3 days later, when the edges go hot and swollen, and there is nothing left to do but wait and see which way it goes. In a world with no antibiotics, a careless slip with a blade was a coin flip on a man's life. Pine resin answered that. It runs thick and antimicrobial, and pressed over a wound, it sealed the opening and kept it clean. The nearest hospital stood about 3 steps away, and it was a tree. Third on the list is one almost nobody expects. Sweat is more dangerous than snow. Work too hard at 40 below, and you soak your own clothing from the inside, and damp clothing loses nearly all of its ability to hold heat. So they moved slowly, on purpose, all winter long. Walking slowly was a survival technique, and where moisture came from outside instead, resin handled that too. Waterproofing seams, sealing moccasins, closing containers, and binding stone to shaft as glue in composite tools. Pine's wood carried the other half of the job. Dense heartwood burns slowly, oxidizing at a rate the wood itself controls. Not a violent heat, a patient one. And across a 6-month winter, patient beats powerful every time. Fourth, immobility. Deep snow turns a 2-mile walk into a death sentence. Willow answered it, because in the cold, rigidity is a fracture waiting to happen, and willow bends. Its fibers realign under stress instead of failing. Snowshoe frames that took thousands of steps without cracking. Sled bindings that held through every jolt. Fish traps that flexed with the current and kept their shape. And the snowshoe is pure physics, equation or not. Spread the load, drop the pressure per square inch below the point where snow collapses, and ground that swallowed you to the waist will hold you up. Narrow frames for dense forest, wide frames for the wind-packed open plains. The willow was never stronger than the cold. It just refused to argue with it. 3 dangers answered. The last 3 happen somewhere no personal skill can save you. Inside the lodge. 5th on the list is heat lost while you sleep, and the shelters answer it 3 different ways. The wiki-up curves, and that curve is aerodynamics. Wind splits around a dome instead of slamming into a wall, while layered bark holds the warmth inside. The pit house goes the opposite direction, sinking into the ground to borrow the Earth's thermal inertia, because soil a few feet down barely notices what the air above it is doing. And the Tipi works like a lung, its cone drawing air up and out through smoke flaps that get adjusted as the wind turns, keeping warmth and breathable air balanced against each other all night. 3 unrelated structures, one shared principle. None of them fights the environment. Each finds a stable place inside it. The fire inside was run as a system, not an event. Tinder first, then cedar and willow twigs to carry the flame from fragile to steady. Then pine and tamarack and hardwood for the long hours. Stones set around the hearth soaked up heat and released it slowly through the night. Thermal batteries made of nothing but rock and understanding. And the ash was never cleared away carelessly. Banked over the coals, it insulated them until morning, so the day began with embers instead of an emergency. 6th and last, hunger and sickness. Meat sliced thin, wind-dried, then smoked until it would keep for months, stored in birch bark containers that held out damp and cold alike. Willow bark chewed for pain, carrying salicin, the compound chemistry would later refine into aspirin. Cedar smoke cleaning the air of a sealed lodge where a dozen people breathed all winter. And now the person we left behind. The old ones couldn't hunt anymore, couldn't pull a sled or carry a load. By every modern measure of productivity, they were a cost. But the calendar lived in their heads. They knew which springs the bark had loosened 2 weeks early. They remembered the hunger 40 years back and exactly what had pulled people through it. They knew which stands of timber had been overcut when their own parents were young. In a world without writing, the elderly weren't dependents. They were the library. Feeding them was system maintenance. Out there, losing an old person wasn't only heartbreak. It was infrastructure failure. 6 dangers, 6 answers. And still, that deliberate inefficiency sitting there, unexplained. Until now. They always left something behind. Dead wood taken before living wood. Harvests kept under what the land could have given. Whole stands passed over that were perfectly good to cut. Ash carried back and returned to the soil it came from. Judged against this winter, every one of those choices is wrong. It's material left on the table. It's waste. Except they were never optimizing for this winter. The system was built for a winter their great-grandchildren would have to live through. People they would never meet, whose names they would never know. That inefficiency wasn't a gap in their knowledge. It was a time horizon. Which is why the forest was never a resource. It was a partner, held inside a feedback loop that only works in both directions. People survive because the forest continues, and the forest continues because people know when to stop. They weren't planning for winter. They were planning for people who hadn't been born yet, and they never once expected to be thanked for it. We have more information available to us than any generation in history, and we retain less of it than any generation in history. They had nothing to look things up in, so they became the thing you look things up in. This is where history isn't simplified. It's remembered. And across a grey ocean, and far north into country that reaches 60 below, the Vikings and the Athabascans faced the same winter, and answered it with something completely different.